Over the past few days, new details have poured out from the White House, the Pentagon, Congress, and international legal experts. Together, they paint a picture of a covert anti-drug campaign that has suddenly crashed into the hard limits of international law and potentially into the personal legal exposure of some of the most powerful figures in Washington. Let's walk through what we actually know so far, what's disputed, and how experts are answering that core question. Was this a lawful military operation, or a war crime, or even just plain murder? The incident at the center of this controversy dates back to 2 September 2025 in waters of the Caribbean near Venezuela. According to US officials, the operation was part of a broader campaign of strikes on vessels that Washington says are crewed by drug traffickers tied to so-called narco-terrorist groups, such as Venezuela's Tren de Aragua. President Donald Trump, who is currently serving as President of the United States, publicly announced the first strike in early September. He said the target was a boat allegedly carrying large quantities of narcotics from Venezuela toward the Caribbean and ultimately the US. Analysts describe this as the first publicly acknowledged US airstrike in Latin America since the 1989 invasion of Panama. The US says 11 people on that boat were killed. Venezuelan and regional sources have since claimed that several of those killed were not cartel gunmen, but fishermen and other civilians. Human rights groups and local families have raised similar questions about later strikes. If this story ended with that first strike, it would already be controversial, but it doesn't. What has ignited accusations of war crimes is what allegedly happened next. Multiple investigations, including reporting based on US officials and leaked military accounts, say that after the first strike, US surveillance observed at least 2 survivors in the water near the destroyed Venezuelan boat. At that point, according to those reports, a US commander ordered a second strike, a so-called double tap, that killed the remaining survivors. The officer, now publicly identified as giving that order, is Admiral Frank Mitch Bradley, a senior U.S. Special Operations commander. The White House has confirmed that Bradley ordered the second attack. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who oversees the Pentagon, has strongly defended Bradley. In a cabinet-level discussion about the broader campaign against alleged drug vessels, he doubled down on the strategy, saying the United States has only just begun sinking such boats and framing the targets as narco-terrorists threatening American lives. One of the key statements now under the microscope comes from Hegseth's own camp. According to detailed reporting, he is alleged to have issued a verbal directive in line with a no survivors approach on this mission, an instruction that legal experts say would be flatly illegal if it included incapacitated or shipwrecked people. Meanwhile, the White House has described the second strike as lawful self-defense, arguing that the survivors still posed a threat and could call for help from other traffickers. By contrast, legal specialists, including former US military lawyers, say that if shipwrecked people were deliberately targeted once they were out of the fight, this is exactly the kind of act that international humanitarian law defines as a war crime. Inside Washington, the question of who exactly ordered the second strike has become a political firestorm of its own. The White House says Admiral Bradley ordered it in the field as the on-scene commander under rules approved by civilian leadership. Defense Secretary Hegseth has publicly insisted that he did not personally order a second strike on survivors, even as he describes Bradley as a hero and insists he has full confidence in his judgment. President Trump, for his part, is now distancing himself from the most controversial part of the operation. In public comments, he has said he was not aware of a second strike on survivors at the time and that he would not have supported it. One key line, which has already been replayed in countless clips and is likely to be central in any future inquiry, is, "I wouldn't have wanted a second strike on that vessel, Donald Trump, President of the United States." At the same time, the White House press office has given a different version of events, reportedly telling journalists that Trump had said everyone be killed aboard the suspected drug boat, a comment that, if accurately reported and interpreted as a formal directive, would raise extremely serious legal questions about presidential involvement. These conflicting accounts are exactly why multiple congressional committees have now opened investigations and why Admiral Bradley is expected to brief lawmakers behind closed doors. The Venezuela boat strike is not an isolated incident. It's one episode in a wider US military campaign launched in 2025 that uses airstrikes from naval vessels and drones to destroy what Washington says are drug-smuggling boats across the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific. The operation, often linked publicly to Operation Southern Spear, has already resulted in at least 83 deaths in roughly 20 or more separate strikes, depending on the source and the exact cutoff date. Defense officials, including Hegseth, say these actions are meant to protect Americans from drugs that are killing tens of thousands at home. He frames the people on the boats as members of terrorist-linked cartels and gangs. But governments in the region, including Venezuela and Colombia, along with families of the dead and international human rights groups, say the US has provided no public evidence that everyone killed was a narco-terrorist. Some of the dead appear to have been ordinary fishers and migrant workers. That matters enormously for the legal analysis because the law of armed conflict only permits intentionally killing people who are either combatants in an armed conflict or civilians who are directly taking part in hostilities at the time. To understand the war crime question, we have to zoom out from the politics and look at the legal framework. There are three big issues here. Is there even an armed conflict between the US and these alleged drug traffickers? Were the people on the boat legitimate military targets? What are the rules about attacking shipwrecked survivors? The Trump administration has repeatedly tried to frame the campaign as part of a broader conflict with narco-terrorists, but a lot of legal experts say that's not how international law works. To qualify as an armed conflict, you usually need sustained organized violence between at least two parties, often a state and an armed group. Even if you accept that some cartels meet that threshold in places like Mexico, it's much harder to argue that every boat at sea crewed by suspected traffickers is automatically part of a war. If there is no armed conflict in the legal sense, then the law of war, international humanitarian law, doesn't even apply. Instead, every killing is judged under human rights law and domestic criminal law, where deliberately killing people outside of immediate life or death self-defense is typically just called murder. That's why one group of former US military lawyers has warned that if the kill everyone approach is not legally part of a recognized conflict, it could amount not just to a war crime, but to ordinary criminal homicide. Even if you accept the administration's argument that this is a kind of non-international armed conflict against organized narco groups, the law doesn't let you kill just anyone you suspect of being linked to them. Under the laws of war, you can directly target members of organized armed groups with a continuing combat function or civilians, but only while they are directly participating in hostilities. So if the people on the Venezuelan boat were actively armed, firing at US forces or clearly operating as part of an organized armed group, they might be lawful targets during a firefight. But if they were unarmed crew, coerced couriers, or fishers misidentified as traffickers, deliberately killing them would likely be unlawful even during a conflict. And if you accept the reports that at least some victims across the campaign were civilian fishers, that opens the door to allegations of extrajudicial killing. The most damning legal issue, though, is the second strike on survivors. International humanitarian law is very clear on one point. Shipwrecked survivors and other persons who are out of combat because they are wounded, captured, or otherwise incapacitated are protected and cannot be intentionally attacked. This principle runs through the Geneva Conventions and is reaffirmed in the US. Defense Department's own Law of War manual, which explicitly tells American service members that killing shipwrecked survivors is illegal and that they must refuse orders to do so. That's why US legal experts have been so blunt. One former military lawyer, quoted in recent coverage, summed it up as essentially murder if the second strike intentionally targeted people in the water who were no longer fighting. A key line from a statement by a group of former judge advocates general HEEs captures their view. If an order to kill everybody, including incapacitated survivors, was given and carried out, then it would constitute a war crime in any armed conflict and murder if there is no armed conflict at all. Former JAG's working group statement summarized from public reporting. That's the core of the war crime allegation. On one side, you now have a growing chorus of critics. Human rights organizations pointing to the second strike as a textbook example of an unlawful attack on people who were hors de combat. International law scholars and former U.S. military lawyers arguing that the legal justification offered by the White House, self-defense against potential future phone calls to other traffickers, does not meet the threshold for lethal force against shipwrecked survivors. Regional governments, including Venezuela's, accusing the U.S. of extrajudicial executions and calling for international investigations. One pointed assessment from a prominent legal expert speaking about the alleged kill everyone order was, "This is not counter-narcotics policing. This is the kind of conduct we have historically prosecuted as a war crime." Summary of views from international law scholars cited in recent reporting. On the other side, US officials insist the operation is legal. The White House says the second strike was well within the legal bounds of the law of armed conflict and argues that the survivors remained a threat because they could signal other traffickers or retrieve the drugs. Hegseth has framed the entire campaign as a necessary escalation in a decades-long war on cartels that, in his words, are poisoning Americans and operating like terrorist organizations. Some administration allies portray critics as more concerned about the rights of traffickers than about communities ravaged by drugs. So far, no US court, domestic or international, has actually ruled on the legality of the Venezuela boat strike. That's why the answer to did the US commit a war crime still depends on how you interpret the facts and the law. In Washington, the political system is now scrambling to catch up with the fallout. Congressional committees in both the House and Senate have opened investigations into the September 2 operation and the wider pattern of strikes. They are seeking operational logs, legal memos, and drone footage. Admiral Bradley is expected to brief lawmakers in a classified session where he will likely be asked directly whether he ordered the second strike and on what legal basis. Defense Department lawyers are reportedly reviewing whether any orders given on that mission violated the U.S. Law of War Manual or the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Internationally, human rights groups are pushing for independent inquiries, potentially involving UN bodies or international courts, especially if they conclude the U.S. is unwilling to seriously investigate itself. One of the stark warnings from ex-military legal officials is about command responsibility. Under established law, if an unlawful order was given and carried out, liability doesn't stop with the person who pulled the trigger. It can climb the chain of command, potentially as high as the defense secretary or even the president, depending on what they knew, said, or authorized. Given all of this, how are independent experts answering the question? Most careful analysts are saying three things at once. There is a strong prima facie case that the second strike on shipwrecked survivors was unlawful under international humanitarian law if it happened as described in the reporting. The deliberate killing of incapacitated survivors is one of the clearest red lines in the law of war. Whether it's technically a war crime or just murder may hinge on whether courts accept the Trump administration's claim that there is an armed conflict between the US and the alleged narco groups. If they reject that claim, we're in the realm of human rights law and domestic criminal law, not the laws of war, but the act would still very likely be illegal. Ultimately, only a formal investigation and legal process can give a definitive answer. That might mean US courts applying the Uniform Code of Military Justice, or, in theory, some form of international inquiry if domestic processes are seen as inadequate. In other words, from a legal analysis point of view, the safest summary right now is there is credible evidence and serious expert opinion suggesting that the US may have committed a war crime or at least unlawful killings in the deadly Venezuela boat strike, especially with the alleged second strike on survivors. But until investigations are complete and a court rules, that remains an allegation, not a formal conviction. Whatever happens next in Congress or the courts, this incident is likely to shape debates about US use of force far beyond the Caribbean. It raises fundamental questions. Can the US declare itself at war with narco-terrorists anywhere on Earth and then use wartime rules to kill suspected traffickers at sea? How far can self-defense be stretched to justify killing people who are in the water unarmed and seemingly out of the fight? Who is held responsible when high-level signals like no survivors or kill everyone appear to trickle down into operational orders? For families in Venezuela, Trinidad and Tobago, Colombia, and other countries whose relatives never came home from fishing trips or coastal journeys, these are not theoretical issues. As one grieving relative put it in regional media, they simply want to know who killed their loved ones and why. For US service members, the case is also a stark reminder of something they are taught from day one. Unlawful orders must be refused even in combat, principle emphasized in the US Law of War Manual and reiterated by former Judge Advocates General and 4 political leaders in Washington. The Venezuela boat strike is now a test of whether those principles are actually enforced, not just against rank-and-file troops, but also against admirals, cabinet secretaries, and even presidents. So if you're watching this and asking, did the US commit a war crime in the deadly Venezuela boat strike? Here's the bottom line. Yes, there is serious, fact-based concern from credible legal experts that the second strike on survivors in the Caribbean violated the laws of war and could qualify as a war crime. Yes, there are also allegations that some of those killed across the broader campaign were civilians, which would raise additional human rights and criminal law issues. But no, there has not yet been a court ruling or formal legal finding that a war crime was committed. That will depend on evidence, investigations, and how judges interpret the facts and the law. Until then, the Venezuela boat strike will sit at the uncomfortable intersection of the war on drugs, the law of war, and the politics of power, a case study in how quickly a secretive military campaign can collide with the very rules it claims to defend.